Welcome to the Latchkey Tales, Book 1, Yuki O'Malley and the Belfair, a tale of Victorian horror, written and performed for podcast by M.J. Hahn. Chapter 5, The Prisoners of Snob Hill. December 10th, 1984. At sunset, Tina Bleeberman snapped awake, only to find herself floating alone in a corner of the Belfair's ceiling, bobbing like some lonely discarded helium balloon.
This ghost business is going to take some getting used to.
She shimmered down towards the cluster of chairs where she had sat the night before. All traces of the evening's events had been cleaned up. Someone had even removed her backpack from the floor where she had dropped it. The backpack that had gone everywhere with her. Tina scoffed.
What does it matter? Backpacks are for the living.
Tina drifted as she realized that the strange interference which had been hanging in the air above seemed to have dissipated. She reached out with her scanner, turning her head like a satellite dish, and smiled. DerVinter was in the same spot he had been in before, seated at his desk in his library, poring over his papers. Tina smirked, cracked her knuckles, and solidified. She was more than ready for a little grudge match. Then, just at that moment, the conservatory beyond the grand staircase's archway was suddenly filled with the rosy violet light of the sunset's final rays. The shining windows of the downtown cityscape were like jewels glinting in Tina's eyes. Her streets were beckoning. Before, when Tina had spent her days spare changing on some street corner, she remembered looking up and fantasizing about zooming around between the skyscrapers, screeching like some sort of demented bird of prey as she dive-bombed all the yuppies. And now she could actually fly? It was too good to pass up. Plus, it's not like DerVinter was going anywhere. Tina turned and gave her scanner a little perfunctory nudge towards downtown, and then frowned when it snapped right back at her. She focused and tried again, and sure enough, there was an invisible boundary around the house, preventing her from sensing anything beyond. Tina recognized the same strange interference that had messed with her vision before, but needless to say, she'd been a little too distracted to notice if this outer barrier had been there or not. Tina shot across the room in a series of shimmery flashes, moving around the walls like a trapped insect.
No way. No friggin' way.
In a flash and a flurry of palm fronds, Tina shimmered towards the conservatory. She pounded her fists on the windows to no avail. The city stretched out alive before her, yet even in a room made almost entirely of glass, her way was barred. Tina growled as she looked out over the darkening skyline.
So much for a friggin' afterlife.
Eternity trapped in this place was more than she could bear. Her visions of citywide mayhem had just been reduced to some sort of sad haunted house cliché. A blip went off on Tina's scanner from above. Her knuckles seemed to crack involuntarily as her eyes narrowed. DerVinter was feeling good about something. Tina flew upwards towards the ceiling, zeroing in on DerVinter's signal. She rose up to the floor of the gaudy, heavily ornamented library unnoticed and shimmered over to a discreet corner, the best vantage point for spying. Rather than charge in for the kill, Tina restrained herself and conserved her energy. She remembered what had happened before and didn't want to have to worry about suddenly winking out again. She drifted into a bookcase, allowing just enough of herself to peek out so she could see. Amid a vast and cluttered assortment of antiques, Mr. DerVinter sat at an ornate desk. With his shirt sleeves rolled up, he moved several sets of blueprints, clearing a spot for the silver tray, which was being delivered by a pale woman with short black hair and dark glasses.
Thank you, Flack.
He lifted the silver dish cover and sniffed with approval. Reaching for the salt, his attention was suddenly drawn to a small object on the corner of the tray.
Goodness, Flack. Wherever did this little bubble come from?
DerVinter's eyes pored lovingly over the fine engraving on the small silver pot.
Oh, you know, from the auction 3 months ago?
DerVinter paused to recollect with a raised eyebrow, then resumed sprinkling salt over his broiled lamb while marveling at his impeccable taste. He looked up from his plate to see that his assistant was still standing there. Mrs. Fleck seemed to choose her words carefully.
Well, I thought I should tell you. Her ladyship is upset and refuses to eat.
DerVinter chewed, his eyes flashing.
It's that woman, that Lamal.
DerVinter rolled his eyes and waved a dismissive fork.
Yes, we've all heard about how nobody gets along with Audra, but I'm afraid she's a necessary evil for the present, and she's only staying in that old ballroom, so neither you...
His eyes suddenly shot overhead.
...or anybody else will have to deal with Madame La Mole.
Okay.
DerVinter looked up from his plate again upon seeing that his assistant still hadn't made herself scarce.
Was there something else?
Mrs. Flack produced a Walkman out of a rather battered backpack. From her hiding place, Tina perked up as Mrs. Flack looked puzzled.
I found this downstairs. Strange. I can't imagine any of our clientele listening to something called Teenage Knife Fight.
DerVinter rose abruptly and snatched the backpack out of Mrs. Flack's hands, just as his telephone started to ring. She went to answer it, and DerVinter shot her a glance that froze her in her tracks.
Thank you, Flack. You're very thorough as always. Now, how about you getting back upstairs and resuming your job? You look after Lady Iwanaga, and I'll worry about downstairs, including the lost and found.
The phone continued to ring as Mrs. Flack retreated, looking stung. DerVinter returned to his desk, wadding up the backpack as if he meant to throw it in the trash. Then his eyes shot overhead again and he relaxed his grip, merely tossing the bundle aside into an armchair. Tina glared as DerVinter picked up his phone. It was one of those old-fashioned numbers that French hookers always seem to have in the movies.
Hello? Oh, yes. Silas. Now, don't worry. I've finished making the final adjustments. It will be perfect this time, I promise.
Suddenly, DerVinter was cut short, and his brow furrowed.
What's that? But I thought you said they were all orphans. Ah, I see. What a bother. Well, two'll have to do, for now. Yes, of course, I realize our predicament. Fine. See you later, then.
DerVinter hung up his phone and sighed. The mostly untouched meal in front of him suddenly seemed repellent, and he pushed the tray away, choosing instead to pour himself a glass of claret. DerVinter returned to his blueprints, and Tina drifted along the wall, still hidden in the large bookcase. As she closed in, a slight chill wafted through the air. DerVinter shivered and pulled his suit jacket over his shoulders while muttering,
"These old drafty houses."
From behind, Tina carefully peered across the desk and surveyed the plans that held DerVinter's attention so completely. Even from that distance, it wasn't difficult to make them out. Tina recognized the building instantly. It was Oddfellows. It seemed that the place was due for some major renovations. An entirely new wing was going to be added, something that was going to be called the Lilac Acres Wellness Home for Seniors. All Tina could make out was a honeycomb of row after row of tiny rooms all crowded and stacked together like some sort of prison or warehouse. She raised an eyebrow. Nothing about it screamed wellness, that was for sure. Then a particular piece of paper at DerVinter's elbow caught Tina's attention. Under the familiar purple Oddfellows letterhead was a typed list of names. Her own was now crossed out at the top, followed by 3 others that were very familiar. Margaret Mears, Annie McGrew, and Sloane Strand. Apparently, the remaining Holy Terrors were due for makeovers at the Belfair as well. Tina gasped. A tiny shockwave sent the paper fluttering off of the desk. DerVinter looked up with a start, his cold gray eyes scanning the room. Tina instantly retreated and went as transparent as she could. As DerVinter's eyes darted from corner to corner, his gaze seemed to pass over her. Tina let herself relax, feeling her upper hand slowly returning. She silently chuckled as DerVinter surveyed the ghost-free corners of the room. Then it occurred to her that he didn't seem exactly scared, which, considering Tina's current condition, pissed her off more than slightly. While DerVinter returned to his blueprints, Tina stalked him in a wide circle, focusing her energy into her fists. As before, her substance began to coalesce, moving up her arms and throughout her body until she was solid. With a snarl on her lip, Tina flew in for the kill. Her shimmery blur shot towards DerVinter, while she landed a thunderous right hook on his offensively tanned cheek. DerVinter flinched, and Tina's punch went slightly off target, smacking him in the eye instead, with enough force to send him flying back into his chair. Tina pulled back, preparing for her second attack, while DerVinter spun, clutching at his face. Tina charged, and as she closed in, she saw a sudden flash of silver. DerVinter had grabbed the antique Russian salt cellar and flung it towards her. The burning cloud of salt hit Tina square in the face, catapulting her back. Hurling across the room, Tina landed partially in the floor as her solidity began to flicker. She blinked, struggling to regain her wits, grumbling as she realized that her power had drained once again. No matter how hard she tried to hang on, it was impossible to remain awake. Finally, Tina slipped away and dissolved out of sight. DerVinter flopped back down behind his desk, gingerly tapping at his eye, having just located his missing essence. Rather than ending up in a glass vial as planned, it seemed that his product was now a freewheeling spirit with a penchant for fisticuffs. Perfect on top of everything else. DerVinter topped off his wine glass and drained it in one gulp. He rose from his chair and promptly exited the library. He ventured down a hallway that was crowded with portraits, including one of particular scale, whose subjects included a rather striking woman richly dressed with luminous gray eyes. She had 2 small boys on her lap, each with the same piercing gray eyes and silver blonde hair as their mother. DerVinter seemed to make a point of ignoring the portrait as he passed. He entered his stately bedroom and disappeared inside the enormous walk-in closet. Here he filed past the rows of his custom Italian suits to a large armoire standing at the back. He pulled open the doors to reveal shelves crammed with stacks of enameled boxes. The bulk of these seemed to contain jewelry, rings of every shape and size, heavy gold pocket watches with fine chains and elegant fobs, tie clips and tie pins, not to mention a dizzying collection of cufflinks, some of which contained quite a few carats. DerVinter smiled. So many gifts from so many manufacturesses. After several minutes of searching, DerVinter found what he was after. A slim black wooden case, rather simple and unadorned, yet heavy in his hands. He opened the lid, and his face was lit with the gleaming silver of the box's contents. DerVinter smiled again, snapped the lid shut, and tucked the box under his arm. Then he turned his attention to one of the armoire's higher shelves, which was crowded with row after row of designer sunglasses. He sifted through the eclectic selection of frames from various decades until he found an understated pair of antique silver spectacles with rectangular light blue lenses. He slipped them on with a little smirk as the bruise around his eye began to darken. Very well, Miss Bleeberman. Do your worst. Should his guest make another appearance, he would be ready. Later that evening, around 10 p.m., the Belfair's iron gate slammed shut behind the black Mercedes as it descended down the dark tunnel. Margaret Mears and Annie McGrew sat side by side in the spacious back seat. Phillgrave was glowering behind the steering wheel, clearly in one of his usual foul moods. Margaret had broken Holy Terror's protocol and was looking a little too eager about her first professional makeover. But then again, she hadn't ever done anything to her curly auburn hair except grow it. So, as far as she was concerned, any change would be an improvement. Annie merely sat huddled in her leather jacket, twiddling with the front bits of her black nail-spike mohawk, clearly not sharing Margaret's enthusiasm. Yet, despite their polar opposite expressions, a single question was on both of their minds. What had happened to Tina? Mr. Phillgrave had chuckled and said that Tina's makeover had gone better than he had expected. Somehow Sloane thought that Phillgrave seemed a little too happy when he cared to elaborate about how Tina wouldn't be returning to Oddfellows because they had already found a new permanent place for her. Then Phillgrave had smiled that horrible smile of his.
And if we're lucky, we'll find permanent places for the rest of you little darlings as well.
Now Margaret and Annie looked at each other in the Mercedes' back seat, both wishing that Sloane was there with them. Everything always seemed easier whenever Sloane was around, but recent events had changed all that. The morning after Tina's makeover, Sloane's parents had suddenly arrived at Oddfellows from some distant suburb, which was strange because Margaret and Annie were sure that Sloane had said that she had no family at all. Then it turned out that Sloane had actually run away from private school the year before. Naturally, Phillgrave balked at this tale. But when Sloane's parents threatened to get the police involved, not to mention filing a lawsuit of such epic proportions, that Phillgrave had no choice but to release Sloane from Oddfellows with a strained and brittle smile. Needless to say, her makeover had been cancelled. Philgrave's Mercedes coasted to a halt in front of the glowing doorway. A tall man wearing a toothy grin and a gray suit descended the stairs. His deep tan was doing little to disguise the rather prominent black eye which had bloomed behind his light blue lenses. Philgrave exited the car and chuckled at DerVinter as he approached.
What happened to you?
DerVinter's eyes flashed with a murderous look, and Philgrave merely shrugged, moving around to the back of the car where he began rummaging through the trunk. DerVinter resumed his pleasant demeanor. He opened the Mercedes' rear door and gallantly offered a helping hand.
Good evening, ladies. Miss Mears, Miss McGrew. I'm Mr. DerVinter. I'm sorry, but there may be a slight delay. We're waiting for my other associate to arrive.
Philgrave's head popped up from behind the trunk.
What do you mean delay? Where's she gone and slithered off to at this hour?
DerVinter's gaze went icy as it shifted to Philgrave.
I'm so sorry to hear that Miss Strand won't be joining us this evening. How fortunate for her to be reunited with her family so suddenly.
Philgrave's jowls quivered, and he disappeared back into the trunk of the car. DerVinter's smile rekindled as he turned back to the girls.
Now, you two don't secretly have some pesky parents or guardians hiding someplace as well, do you?
There were nervous chuckles as Margaret and Annie were led up the stairs. Suddenly, the loud metallic clank of the iron gate echoed down the dark tunnel, followed by the approaching ear-splitting racket and blinding headlamp of Madame Lamalle's motorcycle. She rode through the tunnel at breakneck speed, coming to a screeching halt next to Philgrave's Mercedes. Dismounting, she undid the bungee cords which secured an enormous Chanel bag onto the back of her bike. Madame's ensemble for the evening was decidedly noir. She wore old-fashioned black riding leathers, black boots, black gloves, and on her head a vintage spiked pickle helm with oversized goggles. A cigarette dangled from her dark red lips, and a distinct purple bruise stood out on her jaw, even under the layers of makeup.
Why, hello, Audra. How nice of you to join us.
Philgrave grumbled from the trunk of the Mercedes.
Stuff it, Silas. I was out of provisions.
She hoisted her bag over her arm with the sound of several bottles clinking together. Madame Lamalle nursed her bruised jaw while she approached the stairs where DerVinter waited with the two timid-looking girls. His professional smile clicked on instantly.
Ah, yes, here she is. Ladies, may I present my collaborator, Madame Lamalle.
DerVinter added a little flourish with his hand as Lamalle came closer. She regarded the two girls through her dark goggles.
Ugh, we're doing this again? It must have slipped my mind.
Lamalle adjusted her handbag with another tinkle of shifting bottles. She stooped and squeezed Margaret's pink cheek with her cold-gloved fingers.
I hope we have better luck with you, ma chère.
Before Margaret's face could register alarm, Lamalle had lifted her goggles, revealing golden eyes which were already burning at full intensity. Lamalle leveled her gaze, and Margaret crumpled to the floor. Annie managed a mere peep of a scream before Lamalle's gaze found her, and she too collapsed on the spot. Suddenly, DerVinter found himself standing with two unconscious teenagers at his feet. He looked up and regarded Lamalle as her eyes cooled.
My. We are in top form tonight, aren't we?
Philgrave finally appeared from behind the Mercedes, rolling a pair of rickety wheelchairs. Lamalle slung her bag over her shoulder and trotted up the stairs. She looked back before she disappeared through the sliding glass doors.
Allez, you boys get cooking. I'll be down directly. I just need to freshen up a bit.
Philgrave looked puzzled.
Down directly? What does she mean? What's going on around here? It looks like somebody slugged her. And where did you get that black eye anyhow?
Philgrave joined DerVinter at the head of the stairs, wheelchairs in tow. The girls were clumsily loaded in and rolled through the glowing doorway as DerVinter sighed.
It would seem that Audra is at loose ends for accommodations at present, so I'm letting us stay in the old ballroom. For now.
Philgrave's jowls quivered.
Really? Are you sure that's a good idea? Won't her ladyship have something to say about that? Or was she the one who gave you that shiner?
DerVinter bristled slightly as they wheeled their way past the Belfair's circular reception counter.
Lady Iwanaga leaves my business to me. Audra is welcome to stay as long as she proves useful. And so far, she's been doing a bang-up job, as you can plainly see.
The girls' heads lolled in their respective wheelchairs, yet Phillgrave still didn't seem satisfied.
And what else? What aren't you telling me?
DerVinter raised an eyebrow.
Well, to be blunt, it seems that our Miss Bleeberman wasn't quite dispatched as thoroughly as we thought.
Phillgrave went slightly green.
And pray tell, what does that mean?
DerVinter looked at Phillgrave and chuckled.
It means you'd better watch yourself, Silas. The little beast might suddenly spring from anywhere.
Phillgrave swallowed audibly, while DerVinter tapped the silver frames of his blue-tinted lenses.
But not to worry. I've taken certain precautions, so I'll be sure to let you know if I see her coming for you.
Phillgrave didn't seem amused, and DerVinter tried to sound reassuring.
Stiff upper lip, Silas. Let's not panic. Don't forget that we do have an in-house professional. Lady Iwanaga is more than equipped to deal with anything that little guttersnipe might have up her sleeve.
Somehow, Phillgrave didn't seem exactly comforted by this last detail, while they maneuvered the two rickety wheelchairs towards the mirrored corridor and DerVinter's studio. Sometime after midnight, Tina snapped awake. This time, she was waist-deep in the conservatory floor. A full moon cast its silver light through the domed room made of arched windows. The city's skyline and its thousands of office windows twinkled in the distance as if mocking her. Tina rose out of the floor and then frowned, sensing that the barrier to the outside was still in place. So much for her little midnight rampage around the city. The Belfair looked like it was shut down for the night. Only a faint light glowed from beyond the mirrored corridor that led to DerVinter's studio. Tina grumbled, then winced at the tingle that ran across her spectral essence. Her substance was still stinging from DerVinter's retaliation with the salt cellar, a feeling that reminded her of the occasional sunburn she used to get, back when she still had skin. Tina drifted down out of the conservatory while her ghostly brain ticked off any possible strategies. Clearly, DerVinter wasn't some amateur. Her next move would have to be planned carefully. And there certainly wasn't any rush, since now it looked like she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. A strange noise caught Tina's attention from somewhere in the Belfair's darkened recesses. She hovered until she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of gurgling. Tina sent out her scanner in the noise's direction and was shocked at what it showed her. She drifted across the lobby until she saw them. In the murky darkness sat a pair of wheelchairs, each containing a thin, huddled form swaddled in a blanket. Tina moved closer, and her eyes went wide, unable to believe the horror in front of her. The two ancient, shriveled figures, slumped over and drooling, had been her two other best friends besides Sloane. Tina's fists clenched at the sight of Mags and Annie. The Holy Terror's makeovers were underway, but what had DerVinter done to them? Her scanner showed only a hollow outline of what remained, or more like what DerVinter had left behind. Now there was no trace of her best friends. They looked stooped and elderly. Their eyes were glazed over with milky cataracts. Their hair had gone quite white. Mag's once glorious red curls now fell limply to her shoulders in thin gray wisps, while Annie sat slack-jawed with a vacant stare, the sad remnants of her mohawk hanging like a tangle of spiderwebs. Tina's anger rumbled through her. Imagine leaving them down here all alone in the dark after doing this. Her fists flexed involuntarily as her eyes shot overhead.
I've got to stop them!
Tina scanned the way above as she willed herself upwards. Then she felt the drag from her crippled essence as she sort of stalled in midair. Perhaps DerVinter's attack had depleted her energy more than she thought. Suddenly, Tina felt that she had a little more insight as to why ghosts are always supposed to be moaning. At least she could still send her scanner out without too much of a strain. And somewhere above, in a different part of the house, she could detect a small cluster of life pulses. There was Phillgrave, Lamal, and DerVinter, of course. Just sensing his presence fueled Tina's anger, sparking her meager spectral energies like kindling. It looked like she was missing a party with all of her favorite people in attendance. Then Tina frowned. Something on her scanner didn't make sense. Her forehead wrinkled as she glanced down at the two slumped figures in the wheelchairs, then back over her head with a shocked look of disbelief. In addition to all of her favorite people, somehow her scanner was telling her that Margaret and Annie were up there as well. Tina focused all her energy and attempted to will herself up into the air again, which in her slightly weakened state amounted to little more than drifting. Still, she tried to drift as quickly as possible, rising through the Belfair ceiling until her head popped up through the hardwood on the floor above. Now her scanner wasn't necessary. She merely had to follow the sound of the voices that echoed down the long hallway. To save power, she dialed down her solidity until she was practically transparent. Then she moved along the edge of the hall, drifting with her eyes just above the floor like some sort of spectral crocodile. Following the sounds, she ended up discreetly sticking her head into what must have been DerVinter's living room. It was crowded with more of his pricey knickknacks, all glinting in the light of a crackling fire that blazed in the marble hearth. Madame Lamol was draped in an armchair, with DerVinter sitting opposite to her. There seemed to be a considerable amount of tension hanging in the air between them. Phillgrave was nowhere to be seen. Tina maneuvered herself until she was hidden in some heavy drapery, pleased that nobody seemed to notice her. DerVinter was rubbing his temples behind his blue-tinted lenses. Lamol nursed a cocktail glass in her bony hand, while her eyes seemed to be fixed on a side table in the distance. Tina followed her gaze, and then shuddered at the sight of the silver tray and the row of nasty-looking syringes shining in the firelight. They seemed to glow with an odd shimmer that had nothing to do with the flickering light in the room, a strange shimmer that seemed somehow familiar. Suddenly, Tina realized that this was what her scanner had shown her before. The inexplicable remnants of her two best friends were now twinkling from the row of needles. Tina shuddered again as she realized that this was exactly what should have happened to her. Then a sudden tumult of laughter erupted from the bathroom down the hall, which startled everyone. DerVinter and Lamol looked at each other. Approaching footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, and a young man entered the room, walking straight and tall, carrying an empty syringe. Lamol sat upright, with a predatory gleam in her eye. The handsome man had sparkling brown eyes, strangely reflective, the whites almost opalescent. He kept running his fingers through his thick dark hair with a manic grin full of white teeth. A look of pure shock and amazement spread across Tina's face. It was Phillgrave. DerVinter leapt to his feet, his eyes full of hope behind his blue-tinted lenses. Phillgrave strutted around the room, pausing to admire himself in every reflective surface available. DerVinter moved to congratulate him, when suddenly the miracle ended, and Phillgrave doubled over, howling in pain. Tina almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Phillgrave dropped to his knees in an agonizing transition back to his former self. Wide-eyed with pain, the sparkling brown irises dimmed and clouded. The opalescent whites of his eyes yellowed and became bloodshot once again. A gray pallor spread across his skin, and a network of wrinkles and furrows appeared and multiplied. The newly sprouted, lustrous brown locks became sparse and gray once again. Gasping, Phillgrave tried to steady himself against the tremors that shook his body.
Desmond, help me! Save me! The pain!
DerVinter helped Phillgrave into a chair and gave him a solemn, appraising gaze.
Looks like we'll need to adjust the dosage. Just breathe. You'll be fine. Calm yourself.
DerVinter tried to appear nonchalant despite his friend's worsening appearance. Phillgrave seemed to actually be older than he had been before. Lamol approached, unable to hide the look of horror on her face.
Is he going to be all right?
DerVinter nodded, seemingly composed, but something was storming beneath his placid exterior. The spattering of age spots and the migrating wrinkles on Phillgrave's face seemed to be slowing. Fallen dark hair covered his shoulders as if he wore a fur collar. Hiding his revulsion, DerVinter brushed the hair aside.
That's right. Just rest there. You'll be your old self again in no time.
Phillgrave sputtered.
Yes, my old self.
His clouded eyes twinged as if the word smarted. Lamol backed away from the silver tray and the remaining syringes.
Well, Desmond, I think I'll pass. I think I'll stick with the do-it-yourself method.
She circled her face with a finger.
Perhaps not so many nasty side effects, n'est-ce pas? Allez, don't be discouraged. I'm sure you'll get it right eventually. But in the meantime, any more little teenagers show up, you just let me know. Until then, I'll be in the ballroom, having a cocktail.
DerVinter nodded, and Lamal's high heels clacked on the hardwood floor as she departed. His blue-tinted lenses reflected the flickering firelight as they returned to the slumped figure of Phillgrave. His breathing had quieted, and he finally seemed to be resting comfortably.
Silas, not to worry. We're all running short on time around here. But I promise you, it will work. If it's the last thing I do, my friend, it will work.
Tina was shocked silly. She still hovered, with only her head sticking out of the curtains. Across the room, she could sense Phillgrave's faint life pulse. It was almost as weak as Mag's and Annie's had been in the Belfair's depths below. Tina couldn't take her eyes off of Phillgrave, still reeling a little from the spectacle of his transformation. Then a log on the fireplace crackled, and Tina snapped out of her thoughts. It was at this point that she realized two things simultaneously. First, that the strange interference from before had not only returned, but had now completely enveloped the hallway behind her and was pushing her out into the room. And second, that even though she thought she was more or less see-through, DerVinter was staring directly at her through his blue-tinted lenses.
Good evening, Miss Bleeberman. How kind of you to make this so easy.
Tina sputtered as the strange interference grew stronger, now pushing her forwards regardless of how hard she struggled. Finally, she was held suspended like an insect trapped in amber.
What's the deal with this place? Never a dull moment.
Tina's sneer vanished upon sensing that the heart of this strange interference was now moving slowly towards her. A pair of double doors on the opposite end of the room opened, revealing the Japanese woman in the white kimono that Tina had seen earlier, when she had been alive. A wicked grin spread across DerVinter's face.
Miss Bleeberman, may I present the Lady Iwanaga?
The woman's floor-length black hair was flecked with gray. It seemed to swirl around her feet with a life of its own, and the gaze from her eyes, like blackest obsidian, held Tina transfixed. Lady Iwanaga smiled and produced a porcelain-lidded ginger jar, which she had hidden in the folds of her kimono. She removed the lid and raised the jar, and her gaze on Tina intensified.
Welcome, special guest. Welcome.
Tina struggled, but the strange interference was holding her fast. Lady Iwanaga's expression suddenly went cold and cruel. She held the jar so that Tina could see the contents. It was half full of something dark gray like sand. Then Tina felt an odd pang of recognition. The jar contained her ashes.
Reside, rest here, special guest.
A rush of wind filled the room, and once again, Tina could feel the push from the interference behind her, while the pull from the ginger jar increased.
Reside, rest here, special guest.
The words echoed as the wind clamored in Tina's ears. To her horror, she noticed bits of herself flaking off and swirling away inside the vortex that was pulling her inside the jar. As the last of her power ebbed away, it wasn't very long before the final particles of Tina disassembled themselves and disappeared inside. Lady Iwanaga replaced the lid and spoke a strange phrase. The jar rattled and shook, but she held it fast until it finally fell silent and still.
Like a moth to the flame, just like old times.
DerVinter approached, holding a wadded backpack.
I really should dispose of this, but I know how you enjoy keeping a little something personal with each of your special guests.
Iwanaga accepted the bundle, but her expression was stern.
Desmond, this path you have chosen, you know it will not end well.
DerVinter looked surprised.
What? Me? Chosen? Why don't you tell me exactly what choice I had?
His voice rose as Lady Iwanaga turned in silence and disappeared down the long hallway towards the brass elevator in the distance. DerVinter cried after her as the metal cage slammed shut and she began to ascend.
Oh, yes, it's fine for you, isn't it? But what about me? What do you expect me to do? Just lay down and die?
The elevator clanked shut and hummed as the echoes of DerVinter's unanswered question dwindled in the empty hall. He heaved a heavy sigh, then returned to the wilted figure of Phillgrave. And so, Chapter 5 comes to a close. I'd like to thank guest voices on this episode, Lisa Snare as Tina, and Tawny Tackett as Lady Iwanaga. Music on the program provided by freesound.org and incomtech.com. For more info, please check out latchkeytales.com or the Latchkey Tales fan page on Facebook. Please stay tuned for Chapter 6, and until then, this is MJ Hahn saying goodbye for now, and thanks for listening.